It's Ken Harbaugh. We're releasing this episode of Burn the Boats as a special Father's Day bonus. I caught up with my friend Fred Guttenberg in between events on his book tour. He dialed in from a hotel room in New York, so his video quality isn't what you're used to on this show, but I think you'll appreciate why we're posting it anyway. Fred's daughter, Jaime, was killed at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida in 2018. I don't know where Fred found the strength, but in the years since that tragedy, he has become an unstoppable force in the gun safety movement. From confronting Marco Rubio on stage in the days following his daughter's murder, to driving real legislative change in state houses across the country and in Washington, D.C., Fred has been tireless in fighting to protect families like mine. I could not think of anyone I'd rather talk to and learn from on this Father's Day than a dad who has been such an inspiration to me and millions of others. Again, I hope you'll forgive the video quality. If you listen to what Fred has to say, I promise you'll be inspired. And to the dads watching, happy Father's Day. Thanks. I'm Ken Harbaugh.
What could possibly go wrong?
This is Burn the Boats, a show about making tough calls in tough times. America today faces a critical test. Our democracy is under threat. But good people are rising to the challenge. Now is the time to go all in. Now we burn the boats. My guest today is Fred Guttenberg, whose daughter Jaime was killed in the 2018 Parkland shooting. Since then, Fred has become one of the most impactful and inspiring advocates for gun safety. His new book, American Carnage, dismantles many of the myths we hear today about guns and gun violence. Fred, welcome back to Burn the Boats.
Hey, Ken, how are you, man? Good to see you.
I'm good. I gotta tell you, though, I have never been so fixated on a book's table of contents. But when I first opened American Carnage, I got stuck here for like 20 minutes because it's just astonishing the number of myths that you break down that have so dominated the conversation about guns in America. And I'm wondering what gave you the idea to structure the book in this way. So it's basically a field manual to help people challenge the lies that sustain the gun industry?
Listen, it's a great question. My daughter should be turning 20 this July. She was killed just over 5 years ago. And after she was killed, I became really energized in this movement to do something about reducing gun violence. And one of the things that became immediately clear to me is we've spent the past 20 or 30 years creating policy and electing people on lies. True myths. And it is amazing to me how deeply ingrained these lies and myths became. But because of how deeply ingrained they were, combating them became a challenge because there were so many. And so about 2 years ago, my co-author, Tom Gabor, came to me and said, after the Parkland shooting, I started work on a project and then it paused and I want to revisit it. And it's taking on the lies and myths of the gun lobby. And I immediately said, count me in, because there's not been a real, call it a manual, to do that until this book. And here's why that matters. I told you my daughter should turn 20 in July. 20 years ago, it's not a long time, there were only 200 million guns in America. Today, 20 years later, we are over 400 million plus the additional ghost guns. 20 years ago, AR-15 sales were less than 2% of all guns sold. Today, 25% of all guns sold. I literally just told you everything you need to know to understand gun violence in America, and everything else are the lies and the myths that actually put us in this place where we created the gun violence we now see in only 20 years.
As an example of just how ingrained those myths are. I mean, I don't have to make it very far in that table of contents. Myth number 2 stopped me cold because it's one that I have just taken for granted for the past couple of years. It's that an increasing percentage of Americans are buying guns. Turns out that's a
It's
myth.
a lie.
And it's a myth it's a lie that serves the gun industry because it makes it seem like gun culture is spreading. And as someone who feels like I am pretty well versed in the nefariousness of the NRA and the lies they tell, even that one got me. So for anyone who thinks they know this landscape, they still need to buy this book. But can you deconstruct that one? Because, and we could go through all 37. We're not going to, but let's stop on number 2. How did we get to the point where we've been convinced that an increasing percentage, and nuance is important here, an increasing percentage of Americans are buying guns, which is missing?
So actually, you know what? Let me start with myth number 1 and lead into number 2.
Okay.
Because myth number 1 talks about who we are and have been as a country. And as a country, we've always had gun safety laws. We've had a lot of gun owners. You got to remember, as a country, we had hunters and people who use guns for sport and hunting through our history. But we've always had gun safety laws. And, one of the things that happened is in 1977, a guy by the name of Harlan Carter took over the NRA. At a mutiny in their convention in Cincinnati that year. And Harlan Carter, what people didn't know about him was he's a convicted murderer. But he changed a vowel in his name. And so people didn't know it. And he is the guy who pushed America into this place where we were, in our history, a gun safety country. A lot of gun owners spread out across the country, a lot of them, who believed in gun safety and responsible firearms ownership. Harlan Carter realized that the things that drove gun ownership in the country, things like hunting and sport, were actually declining. And so he needed to create new markets. And he started to push America into a place through the NRA and threw a lot of money on political people who believed him and on studies that started creating all of these myths. Studies that really started to treat America as you're either a good guy or a bad guy, and all the bad guys already own guns. And so all the good guys, you need to own guns too to defend yourself. And and the whole notion was we are now a country awash in good guys and bad guys who are going to have to own guns. Bad guys because they want to be bad, and good guys because you got to protect yourself. But the truth is, there weren't as many instances of these bad guys with guns attacking good guys with guns every day. And most Americans were feeling secure. Now, the problem is, while it's a declining number of Americans who own guns, there are more guns. And, we've doubled the arsenal. And in recent years, especially like starting around COVID, we've seen the percentage of Americans becoming first-time home buyers, first-time gun owners and bringing guns into their homes increasing because of the success of the NRA pushing this idea that we're all at risk of these bad guys. It's crazy how they've used lies and myths to literally build an industry. And in 20 years, these lies and myths, the types of things, the numbers of defensive uses of guns, it's a lie. It was a pure made up lie based on fake data. But the myth took hold. I'll start the sentence. You'll finish it. Okay. Think about this sentence. The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is
a good guy with a gun. And please tell us where that phrase came from.
That phrase started 5 days after the Sandy Hook shooting. We all think that we've heard this forever, right? That it's just been a part of American culture, that notion. It started after the Sandy Hook shooting. Wayne LaPierre, 5 days after, that was his response to Sandy Hook. He turned Sandy Hook. The NRA turned Sandy Hook into a gun sales bonanza. But the truth is, we still don't see the numbers of American families owning weapons that we had in the past. And we do see a concentration of dangerous weapons in a smaller percentage of Americans. And we do see, because there are so many weapons being sold in ways that don't require background checks and other ways to ensure we're keeping them out of the hands of those who intend harm, how easy it is for bad guys to actually get a gun.
Yeah. That political shift you described at the NRA starting in 77 is something I lived through. I was a Cub Scout and a Boy Scout in the 70s and 80s. And I remember the NRA pushing marksmanship and gun safety to Americans of all ages, but in particular to Boy Scouts, right? It was about being safe with your firearms and learning how to shoot. And I think if you go way back, it was about preparing young men in America to join the military and be better shots. That pivot in the 70s has done so much damage. But I wonder if our focus on the NRA sometimes leads us to take our eye off the ball. You'll know better than anybody, so I'm asking you, if we take down the NRA, aren't there other extremist organizations waiting in the wings? I mean, aren't there right now organizations even farther to the right than the NRA? What's out there lurking in the shadows when all of our ire is focused on this admittedly extremely toxic and damaging organization?
A great question. And your question is actually the reason you, as a general rule of thumb, hear me talk less about the NRA these days, because the NRA is really the reason we are where we are, but other organizations now exist. But even worse than that, it's the legacy of the work that they did that we now need to live with. And what I mean by that is they put a lot of money into electing a lot of people who believe what it was that the NRA was saying. And those people currently serve. And so while just back in 2018, before the Parkland shooting, these people were taking NRA money and loving it and wearing the A rating pin, none of them wear the A rating pin anymore, but they don't need to. They really believe the message. And so the legacy of the NRA and the success of it with elections is something that carries the work of those who want to sell more guns forward. And we need to defeat those people. We need to elect them. We need to fire them from office and elect new people. But the other legacy of the NRA and those gun groups, which I think is maybe the most concerning, has to do with the courts. You don't need a gun group focused on elections as much anymore when they're filing lawsuits. And they're using the courts to literally reinterpret what the Second Amendment says, to literally reinterpret laws that we've had on the books for our history to make it easier to get a gun. And I'll just use an example. The Bruen case from last year, Second Amendment case. That was not a lawsuit over some new law that people are disagreeing about. It wasn't anything like that. It was a lawsuit over a law that was over 100 years old, okay, on the books, because we always were a history of gun safety laws. But that law was so pivotal to help the states pass legislation that would keep it so that those who intend harm have a harder time gaining access to a gun. It struck down a law that was over 100 years old. That's what the Bruen case did. I can't make it up, but that's what it did. And when I think of the Supreme Court, and I think of the Second Amendment, I'll give you just one more example. 2008, the Heller decision. You all remember that? The people focused on a lot of what Scalia said back then. One of the things that may be the most meaningful part of the Heller decision is a phrase that now gets attached to the Second Amendment as if it's always been there. But it came out of that Heller decision, common use. And the reason why common use matters is following the Heller decision. Remember I told you in 2003, AR-15 sales were less than 2% of all guns sold? The assault weapons ban ended in 2004. That didn't cause a huge increase in sales of assault weapons. It really started after the Heller decision. In 2008, assault weapons sales were about 4 or 5% of all guns sold. The big spike happened after Heller and that common use language. And common use said, if a weapon is the most popular in its class and in common use, you can't restrict it. In essence, I mean, that is not a legally perfect answer, but that is my in a nutshell answer. And the industry went on a manufacturing binge following the Heller decision. They literally used the Supreme Court decision to develop a business strategy, which, remember back then, they said these weapons are for hunting and sport. But they started manufacturing far beyond the size of those markets and needing to create new marketing strategies to sell them, including marketing to kids, to the point where now here we are 15 years later, only 15 years, and they're now 25% of all guns sold because of that Supreme Court decision, common use. And we now may see this year the Supreme Court in another decision conclude that you can't ban these weapons because they're in common use. And again, this is happening in 15 years. This isn't our history, and people need to understand that. And because it's literally all clustered in this really recent 15, 20-year time, we can fix this with our vote, and we better vote.
You do an incredible job at uncovering some of that history for those who think this world we're stuck in has always existed. I mean, you go back to the Wild West and there were better controls on firearms in towns back then than there are today. Like the Second Amendment is my thing as a legal guy, but talk a little bit about like gun safety in the old days. I mean, you couldn't just walk into a saloon with a hip cannon, right?
No.
They had way more common sense back then than we do today. And it's about money and marketing.
The Wild Wild West is not the way people seem to think of it today. You know, they actually had laws on the books to prevent people from just simply walking into public places with guns and using them, you know, and it was not weird that people expected that, and it continued. I mean, from our founding all the way to 1977, the notion of America as a country with a Second Amendment and responsible gun owners and gun safety was not unexpected. You know, we were able to do both. Have our Second Amendment rights, have our Americans who own guns, but also understand the importance of being responsible and understand how we need to take every step to keep them out of the hands of those who intend harm to someone else or others. This is a really recent thing where we just sort of moved away from that, and all for the purpose of selling more guns for an industry that has put a cost of doing business on the lives of people like my daughter.
You referenced that sales strategy as including marketing to kids. And it's not just, you know, an ad in a section of a paper that young people read. They've actually made AR-15s where the stock will fit in like the shoulder. And what was the one example I'm thinking of that they actually renamed it?
I think it was AR-15 Junior. And, you know, they've also made them in really cute little colors so kids will like them. You have Daniel Defense, who sold the gun that was used in the Uvalde shooting, who literally had advertisements showing how important it was to get little kids started shooting this weapon. You know, Listen, I am the only Parkland parent who still has an active lawsuit trying to sue the gun manufacturer. And the reason why none of the others have joined, it's a really risky proposition because PLACA, if you lose,
Explain that.
so PLACA is a federal law that shields the manufacturer from liability. And if you sue them and lose, they can sue you for damages. And they have done that in the past and bankrupted families who lost loved ones to gun violence.
And this is not a blanket law that protects industry writ large from frivolous lawsuits. We're talking about the gun industry in particular as the only industry
protected
in America that has a special carve out. Go ahead.
Yes. Now, the Sandy Hook families were able to actually successfully have a PLACA claim that got to a settlement. Part of the reason why is they had a state law that gave the ability to kind of find a window through this deceptive marketing practices. And the reason why the manufacturer ultimately settled was that was better than having to release all of the discovery and documents that would have become public. And so in Florida, I unfortunately don't have the ability to have a beneficial state law. In fact, Florida has a statute that's even more onerous than PLACA. And to file my PLACA claim, I have to first get through the Florida statute, which here we are 5 years later, and I'm still trying, but I have a claim going to the Florida Supreme Court, and we'll see where that goes. But what I've done is the lawsuit that I would like to file, I've actually filed a claim with it with the FTC. So, because what I want is we've been able to show how the person who shot my daughter was in fact being influenced by this marketing. And I want those CEOs under oath. I want those documents. I want the tobacco moment. I've already been talking to members of the Senate who do have subpoena power to hold a hearing using the FTC claims and calling those CEOs under oath. The truth is, because you don't have 60 votes in the Senate, they can issue the subpoena, but they can't enforce it. So the executives don't have to come. It would look bad if they didn't, but they would probably rather look bad than release the discovery, because the discovery is damning. We can prove, I have no doubt, if we get them under oath and we see the documents, I am certain we will see the business strategy that led us to where we are today.
Thanks for watching, everyone. We've got a quick message from our show sponsor, but first, I've got a favor to ask. Growing a show like Burn the Boats depends on you. There was a time when thoughtful interviews with interesting guests could stand on their own, but these days, the algorithm is everything. The recommendations that show up in the feeds of YouTube viewers and podcast listeners depend on the reviews that shows like this get. So please give us a thumbs up, follow this channel, and if you're up for it, please consider clicking on the link to the podcast page and leaving us a 5-star review. It makes a huge difference. Thanks. Our next partner is Athletic Greens. I take AG1 by Athletic Greens every morning. I gave AG1 a try because I wanted boosted energy, immune system support, and a supplement that actually tastes great. I take AG1 before starting my day, and it makes me feel ready to take on anything. I'm doing something good for my body, giving it the nutrition it craves. I've tried a ton of different supplements out there, but this is different. The ingredients are super high quality. I noticed right away that it improved my energy levels and made me feel great. AG1 makes it easier to take the highest quality supplements, period. Just one daily serving covers my day's nutritional bases and supports long-term gut health with 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients. It's 1 scoop of powder mixed with water once a day. AG1 is that easy. If I could recommend one additional thing to do to take care of my health, it's this, AG1 by Athletic Greens. I can't think of another daily routine that pays off as well as AG1 which is why I trust it so much. If you're looking for an easier way to take supplements, Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to athleticgreens.com/burntheboats. That's athleticgreens.com/burntheboats. You won't regret it. I hear you say a lot to people wrestling with like the confusing fire hose of facts on this. Focus on the motivation.
Yeah.
I know what your motivations are. You want to keep what happened to your family from ever happening to another family again, to my family. Thank you. But the comparison to the motivations of the people you're going after should be clear as day. And for the gun industry, it's money.
Listen, that to me is what every American should pay attention to, is the motivation of who is asking you to listen on this topic. There are a lot of people like me, survivors, families affected by gun violence, activist groups, and even politicians who are trying to do whatever they can to stop the next shooting. That's our motivation. We're not trying to punish responsible gun owners. We're not anti-Second Amendment. We're not gun grabbers. That's just all part of the lies and the myths, which is why I also am saying a lot, let's stop listening to the liars. Okay, because that's all that is. Our motivation is to stop the next one, to stop a parent from understanding what I do. Now, compare that to those who spread the lies, whether you're part of the industry or you're a political person. Okay, their motivation is to help that industry. Their motivation is to sell more guns because that helps the industry. Even if you're a politician, your help and support of that industry brings you donations and other things that you will value. You're part of that. So I am on the right side on this issue. 80% of America agrees with me. This is not a question of even whether or not my stance is popular. I suspect if you do a poll, my stance on gun owners, which is, again, supported by 80% of America, is more popular than apple pie, okay? And so this is not a question of whether Americans agree and convincing Americans. They are convinced. It's an issue of how we've put ourselves in a place on this issue and others where a minority is managing to thwart the will of the majority. That's the question. And the answer is, if the majority, if those who clearly agree with me on this sit on the sidelines in the next election, you are part of the problem. You can't sit home. You need to vote.
You said this in a recent MSNBC interview. I'll just say to every American voter listening right now, vote in 2024. I don't care if you think it's a perfect candidate, if it's a candidate who says they have a plan to be part of reducing gun violence, who's going to be part of a woman's right to choose, who's going to be part of defending freedom and democracy, vote. What strikes me about that is your linking of these issues, because they're not unrelated, right?
They're not. Listen, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to look at the different sides here. The political parties, the current state of the Republican Party, it's not a responsible governing entity at this point. They're just not. Okay. And there's a lot of Republicans who will tell you the same thing, whether it's my friend Joe Walsh or Liz Cheney. These are not Democrats. These are conservative people telling you to vote for Democrats because they understand there's something different going on right now. And that they want the Republican Party back. But before you can get there, you have to thoroughly beat this party that exists. And so for me, when I look at who it is that supports gun safety, they tend to be the same people who support what the majority of Americans say they want, which is other things like the right to choose, expanded voting rights, protection of environment. These are not minority views. These are majority views, but they are being held up by a minority. Oh, and I'll add to that, protection of our democracy and our Constitution as it exists today. It is those who support reducing gun violence support all those other things. You can I'll make that as a blanket statement. I know it's true. And those who unfortunately want expanded gun rights tend to be the same who will tell you their vote was flawed, or will tell you a woman doesn't have her freedoms that she always thought she had. It's clear. And so here's what I will say to the majority of Americans, okay? What the other side has figured out is how to use language to keep a base. And that's what they are, base. But they're about 35% of the country probably voting. And they will vote. They are hardcore voters right now. And the other side knows it. And that's why they can't pull away from that base right now.
What do you say to the Republican representatives who throw up their hands? And this literally happened on the Capitol steps after, I think it was Uvalde, might have been the Allen, Texas shooting. There's going to be another one tomorrow. And they say we can't do anything about it.
I will say that response is what's going to get you fired. Okay. And I'll use an example. Just this week in Jacksonville, Florida, a Republican stronghold, Donna Deegan won for mayor. And nobody, Democrat, and nobody expected it. And she didn't win because of Democrats. She won because Republicans in large numbers voted for her, and no party affiliates in really large numbers voted for her. And I think you're going to see that across the country. So if you can't be a part of solving the issue of gun violence, you should start working on your resume and prepare to be fired, because Americans are gonna vote. And I will just simply say to Americans, okay, you have to vote. This 24 is the election where you need to get over needing to fall in love with a candidate, where you need to get over, I either love everything about the Democrat or I'm not voting for them. You need to focus on, if they support reducing gun violence, if they support the right to choose, if they support democracy, you don't need to love them, but you better vote for them.
We got to talk about Florida. You brought it up twice now because you've got a governor who may well become the next president of the United States, but even if not, I feel like there is this race to the bottom in his competition with the former president, Trump. You see it on the abortion issue,
yep.
Walking back that how many weeks the ban's gonna kick in. I'm afraid you're gonna see it on gun extremism as well. When you get two egos like that competing for a radical base, which is a sliver of the popular vote, it leads to terrible things. As a Floridian, give us your take on Governor DeSantis.
Governor DeSantis will never be president of the United States. He is not loved in Florida the way people think, and certainly not by 19 points. What he understood clearly is the importance of his 30 to 35% showing up at the polls. And he got them out. And they voted almost completely. And Democrats sat home because they didn't love their candidate, because they didn't feel inspired. If you want to be inspired and you want to fall in love, find other ways to do that, but you got to vote. And the Democrats didn't. That is the reason that he won his reelection in the numbers that he did. And it is the reason that he and Trump are fighting over that base that they know is going to vote. They figure that is their power base. Now, the thing about DeSantis Um, he's an exceptionally weird guy. And I know him, and I've been in the same room with him. And he is an exceptionally weird guy who cannot and will not perform on the big stage. And in live, candid moments, we've all already seen that. So he will not be the nominee. Whether or not it's Trump, I'm still not convinced. And if it is Trump, it may have to happen from a prison cell. But it won't be DeSantis. I will tell you, I'm watching the rumblings of a guy like Youngkin, and he gets me nervous because he's as bad as them, but he looks prettier being bad. You know, he's not as scary looking or sounding. You know, but it won't be DeSantis.
Got it. I got to plug the book one more time. What are some of the myths that surprised you, or did you have this all wired before you put pen to paper?
You know, none of it surprised. I think the disconnect between our history and what people think of who we are now when it comes to our relationship with guns, just how big the disconnect is and how really recent it is, but how strongly it's taken hold shocked me. You know, because again, this is not our history, but it really, but you talk to anybody now, it feels like it is, but it isn't. And I think that to me is one of the more shocking things about the book is how big that disconnect is. The ability of the industry to use completely flawed data on things like defensive uses of guns to successfully create the image that we are a country who has to constantly have guns to protect ourselves from the bad guys who are going to shoot us. It shocked me how successfully they did that because the data is crap. It is really, really bad. But the data ultimately didn't matter. What mattered is the money invested and constantly telling the lie, and the lie took hold. You know, things like that really did surprise me because there's a complete disconnect from reality.
The backstory to that dependence on terrible data is actually a terrible indictment of our political process because it was an institutional thing, right? The CDC itself was banned by law from researching gun violence, which served the gun industry really, really well.
So the CDC was banned from researching. Think about another agency who also was hamstrung and had their budgets completely decimated, and laws were passed that literally prevented it from doing its job, the ATF. Alcohol, tobacco, firearms. The agency tasked with ensuring our public safety from firearms was neutered by the money spent by this industry using these lies. And, you know, they're actually literally they've not been allowed to upgrade their technology. They still use paper in boxes stacked floor to ceiling with records that you have to search through when a crime happens. Okay. You can't make it up, but it is what they did. So they've always said, listen, we have laws on the books. We need to follow the laws on the books while neutering the agency tasked with following the laws on the books. You know, they've always said, if we do anything to reduce gun violence, the smallest little thing, it's a slippery slope. We can't pass new laws because it's a slippery slope. But you know what? In that entire time that they've been saying that, they've been passing a lot of gun laws. But it's the kind of laws that make us less safe. Stand your ground, permitless carry, things that neuter the CDC and the ATF. We've been on the slippery slope. It led us to 400 million guns on the streets and almost 50,000 a year dead.
Yeah, if ever there was a slippery slope case, it's Heller and common use. And now, we have AR-15s that are ubiquitous because they engineered a slippery slope on purpose. I want to switch gears in the time we have left. You never planned this life mission. That all changed on February 14th, 2018. But I'd love you to take us back, weeks or years before that and tell us something about Jaime that you want us to remember.
Jaime, listen, I always taught my children, you always do what's right, not what's easy. Because you can always live with yourself when you do what's right. And Jaime got that message wholeheartedly and really worked hard at doing what was right. And I don't just mean she made good choices. I mean the way she treated other people. I'm so proud of my daughter for her dislike of bullies. She used to put herself in between a bully and somebody being bullied to make it stop, which candidly is her dad made me nervous every day because I always worried about her safety, but she didn't care. And whenever I would tell her she needs to stop, she would basically tell me I should stop. My daughter was petite, and she would just tell me, Dad, you underestimate me because of my size, okay? But she wasn't going to stop because she wanted these kids who were always getting bullied to not have to experience that. People know my daughter as this beautiful competitive dancer, but what they don't know as much about her is how when she wasn't dancing and she wasn't in school, she was volunteering her time for kids with special needs, kids of different abilities, because she wanted them to have the same access to social relationships and just all good things the way that she did. She understood. And my daughter was a fighter for what was good. And I will tell you one little thing about my daughter that maybe sums this up. She had the ultimate BS detector. And I'll never forget during the Trump run for the presidency, she used to come down, she'd watch me watching the news and just be like, I can't believe this country is this stupid. Can't they see he's a liar? Can't they see he's a bad guy? She'd get angry about it. But the country elected him. But she knew it. She saw it. And that's because she understood good and bad. And she really did. She had that BS detector. I miss my kid more than I can tell you.
Yeah. Well, I think it's pretty clear that she's right in the fight with you, Fred. And thank you for doing it for my family and for my kids. As always, it's such an honor having you on.
Ken, thank you, my friend.
Hey Meidas Mighty, love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram @MeidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.